Hey guys, it's Mrs. Dukoski. I am here to start Catcher in the Rye with you. This is one of my favorite books ever. Um, I don't remember when the first time I read it was. I didn't read it in high school. As an English major in college, it was one of the books that I just hadn't ever been assigned. So I said, I need to read this book because it's such a classic. And I read it by myself and I enjoyed it, but it wasn't until I started teaching it with 10th graders that I really fell in love with it. And I love reading it every year, and I'm so glad that we're going to be reading it together. So in this video, I'm going to talk about what you should be considering when you begin reading a book, the major elements that, always are the 6 elements of a work of fiction, a narrative, something that tells a story. So we'll talk about the 6 elements of fiction that we need to start considering as we read any narrative. And again, I say fiction, but there can be narratives that are nonfiction, or there's even narrative poems. So anything that tells a story, like the Odyssey as an example, it's an epic poem, it's a narrative, it tells a story. So you could use the elements in a poem that tells a story, nonfiction that tells a story, or again, our works of fiction. And we're going to look at the different elements. We're also going to talk a little bit about the background, and then we'll get started. We'll read chapter 1 together today. So you should have a packet at home that was sent to you, or there's the PDF in Schoology, which I'll show you. So I'm about to start a screen share, and I'm going to just kind of show you the Catcher in the Rye folder and the items that we'll be using today during this lesson for chapter 1. All right, so here I go. My screen share. I hope everybody's doing well out there. This is exciting. Beginning a new book. All right, here's my screen. And here's our Schoology page. So our Schoology page might look a little bit differently. This was from last year, but there's a folder. It's called Catcher in the Rye. So find the Catcher in the Rye folder on Schoology. And then you will see that there's the online text if you want to follow along online, and I'll have it projected on the screen in this video. You could always just read off your screen too, or you have your own copy, which is an option as well. Here's the Catcher in the Rye PowerPoint that we're going to discuss, just some introductory items. We'll look through it quickly. You need to look through it carefully, because questions from this PowerPoint will be on our first quiz. And then here's the Catcher in the Rye chapter 1 notes. So I'm going to start with this PowerPoint. Here's the PowerPoint. Just looking at this PowerPoint quickly. It's your real traditional background info PowerPoint. I didn't make it, I found it, but it was just such a nice overview. I couldn't help myself but borrow it. So Catcher in the Rye, The Catcher in the Rye, which we'll find out what that title means, but not until later in the book, is by this famous author named JD Salinger. JD is Jerome David. He is an American writer. He was born in New York City in 1919. He lived until 2010, so he had a nice long life. And his book became one of the most famous books in American literature during the 20th century. So he like flew to fame. He actually started writing this book. He created the character Holden Caulfield, who's our main character, in a short story before writing Catcher in the Rye. And then J.D. Salinger, the author, he was a combat soldier for the Americans during World War II. He was in the army. He fought in D-Day, and he was drafting Catcher in the Rye during the war. So there's I'll share a picture with you during a future lesson. There's a picture of him writing this book. So he had the draft of Catcher on him as he was fighting during the war. So I love that part of this story, that our writer, where he must have been psychologically, physically, just in his life as he penned the words of Catcher, kind of knowing that a good portion of it was written when he was a soldier at war. All right, so with that said, and he saw serious combat too. With that said, after the war, he returns and he has it published, and it becomes like this super well-known book. And he, like, it becomes famous, so famous that it makes him unsettled, and he ends up moving to New Hampshire to get away from the fame. And he lives the rest of his life there as, you know, as a recluse in the woods of New Hampshire. And he did live until 2010, and he was like so turned off by the fame that he also refused to publish any more of his writing. So this is kind of like interesting about him. And there's a whole documentary called Salinger if you want to learn more about him. I recommend it if you're interested. So he chose not to publish any more of his works after Catcher in the Rye. It was the only novel that he's had published, even though he does have other writing. His estate now owns the writing. There's been some talk about having it published posthumously, which means after someone has died, but nothing has come out yet. So just, you know, a note about JD Salinger and his writing. So with that said, Catcher was released in 1951, and it changed his life, and it changed Americans' life as well. It was such an impactful book on our culture. It still is. We're reading it today, not as much as it was, you know, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, the first 50 years after it had been written. But it is still being read today, and the character, Holden Caulfield, and the style of his writing, which is a first person, it's called Stream of Consciousness. We'll talk more about that as we read. Hugely changed like the way that people understood a character. So this character was like a character like we had never really read. And so I think that's something to be said before we get started. There's also, you might be seeing here, this controversy, which we'll talk more about. I have a whole article about it. There is this man named Mark David Chapman, who is the man that killed John Lennon. If you don't know who John Lennon is, you should look him up. He's very famous. He was one of the Beatles, and he was shot in New York City by this man named Mark David Chapman in 1980. It was like an event that shook the world. John Lennon was killed, right? And so there's a connection with the man who killed Lennon and the book Catcher in the Rye. So I'll just tease that right now, and we will talk more about that as we read the book. But just, you know that that's a fact. And then just some more facts about the book, other texts that he's written, and some recurring themes. So look through this more carefully. Be aware that some questions on your first quiz will come from this PowerPoint. So, have a look. All right, so with that said, that's just your basic background PowerPoint. Now, before we start reading chapter 1, which we are going to read together in this presentation, Catcher chapter 1 notes. I'm just going to take a look at these. These are just some basic notes from me. I love to read. I've been teaching, oh my gosh, I've been teaching English. This is my 19th year teaching English. That's crazy. But there are some things that I know as a reader and a teacher, and I like to write too, though I prefer to write poems, that when I sit down to consider a narrative, again, narrative is something that tells a story, and this is a work of fiction, so it is a narrative. There are things that I always consider, and we're going to come back to them as we read all of our books this year. So they should be things that you're familiar with, but I want to remind you of them. And again, we will be doing our literary analysis, it's called, through the lens of these major elements. And then we'll also start weaving in literary techniques or writing techniques. But I want to just kind of hit the major elements first for chapter 1. So the major literary elements, there are 6 of them. They're in every narrative. So if you're a writer or a reader, you can anticipate any piece of writing that's a narrative, that's telling a story. It's going to have these 6 things in common. You can't write a story without them. And then after the 6 major elements, they're called, we have writing techniques or literary techniques. These are like the choices. Like if you went up to the buffet, which I don't think we can do right now. It's probably not suggested to go to a buffet right now. But if you went to a buffet and you could just pick and choose the things that you wanted, that's what the techniques are. It's like the choices that the writer has after they've incorporated the 6 major elements in their narratives. So maybe some figurative language, you got metaphors, similes, right? That type of thing. Maybe I'll throw in a flashback, some foreshadowing, some symbolism. These are choices. You see them often in writing, but I don't have to use a flashback. I don't have to have symbols. Again, these are techniques, but what we're going to talk about today are the 6 elements in every work of fiction, and again, any narrative. So narratives can also be nonfiction and poetry, but we're focusing on fiction. So plot, yes, you have to have a plot. Traditional plots, plot is a chain of events, right? Traditional plots follow, and you can probably picture the plot diagram. I will share a plot diagram with you, but that, you know, that mountain that the teachers draw on the board where we label it the plot diagram. The beginning is the exposition. Then we get to the inciting incident, which is really fancy for just introducing the conflict. The incident is the conflict. Then you get that big slope up the mountain, rising action. The peak is the climax. Then we come down, the falling action, and finally we get a resolution to your story. This is a traditional plot, all right? Catcher in the Rye will follow this traditional plot. There are some non-traditional plots too, but I just, we should be most aware. Most of what we read in narratives follows these traditional plot patterns. So that is an element, the chain of events, the plot. Characters. Characters is another element. You can't have a story without characters, right? So especially the protagonist, which is the main character. You got to get rid of the good guy, bad guy. If that's in your head from, you as a younger reader, we got to get rid of it. Because as we read these more mature works, our protagonist is our main character. Essentially, the plot follows the protagonist. That's how you know who the protagonist is. All right. The plot, it's like the protagonist is in a car driving through a bunch of events, and the events can't unfold without this character. That's your protagonist. It's not always a good guy, right? We can't simplify it like that. In fact, Holden is called he's like an anti-hero. We'll talk about that in a future lesson too. He has a lot of human character traits that are not so desirable. And that was sort of popular in the 20th century to introduce these characters that were human, that had strengths and weaknesses. So there are some undesirable traits that our protagonist Holden's going to have. And then the antagonist, whatever's working against the main character. So it might not even be human, right? It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just working against our protagonist. And, it could maybe even be the protagonists themselves, all right? Maybe they're working against themselves. So we'll talk about that as well. But these characters are another element. And then, of course, there's all the other minor and major characters. Settings, the time and place that we talk about in our stories. Point of view. Is it a first-person point of view? Right? Is there a character telling the story? In this case, it is. Holden is telling us the story. Holden Caulfield. We'll meet him in a moment. Second person. We don't get these that much, though Holden does use you. He breaks what's called the fourth wall, and he talks directly to the audience. That's a writing technique that Salinger uses. It's part of that stream of consciousness. So we'll look at that, but it is a first-person narration. So don't get confused. You'll see the word you. He talks directly to the audience, but it's not a second-person narration. That would be entirely in that you point of view. I like to say the choose your own adventure stories, if you've ever heard of those, where they direct the audience. You will open a door. You need to choose which way will you walk. Will you walk to the right? Will you walk straight ahead? Will you walk to the left? Or maybe you turn around and go back out the door. That is an example of a second person narration. So we don't get those that much in fiction. Third person narration, We either have third, what's called omniscient. That's where the narrator can kind of look into the lives of all the characters, but it's an outside narrator. The narrator's not in the story. That's what third is. So we have this outsider looking in, telling the story. So maybe they see all of the characters and kind of bounce around, or maybe it's limited. And the third person narrator who's outside of the story is looking in, but telling the story as though they're sort of following the major character around. So they'll follow one character around, and you'll know that one character well more than you will the rest of the characters. That's called limited, third limited. And then the other two, again, these are the elements in every narrative. Themes, major ideas, prevailing messages throughout the book. It usually takes a good couple chapters to start understanding what some of these themes might be. Conflicts. We've got external conflicts and we've got internal conflicts. These are your person versus person, person versus society, person versus nature, person versus other, something else, or person versus self. That's internal, right? You'll have a major conflict in a narrative that gets introduced, like pretty much we'll find out in the first chapter or two what the major conflict is. We'll find out what Holden's major conflict is in chapter 1. And then you'll have these other conflicts, these minor conflicts that pop up throughout the rest of the story. There'll always be a major conflict that the character's trying to resolve and work through over the course of the story. And then as we start, which we're about to start, chapter 1, this is exposition. So think, my main character, who is it? His name is Holden. He's a protagonist. We'll meet him right away. He's telling us a story. What is the setting I'm being introduced to? He'll introduce us to a setting. He'll talk about a couple others. What is the point of view? Well, we know Holden's telling the story, so the main character, it's going to be first person. And is there a major conflict introduced? Yes, there will be. I'm not going to spoil it for you. You'll see when we get there. So with that, these are all the things we're going to start thinking about as we read Catcher in the Rye. And they're really like just general points to consider when you're analyzing literature. All right, so these are the ways, this is the language that you need to use. We're going to almost start using these terms regularly when we talk about our books. All right, so that is that. Go back to my Catcher in the Rye folder. I'm going to pull up the online text. So again, find your text, or you can follow along here, find the PDF. Get ready. The Catcher in the Rye. Sorry, I'm drinking tea. Hope it doesn't distract you too much. And I have this tea mug. I'll show you when we're done with chapter 1. It's my Catcher in the Rye tea mug that I'm drinking my tea out of right now. I think Salinger would be happy to see this. So, to my mother, chapter 1. If you really want to hear about it, the first thing you'll probably want to know is where I was born and what my lousy childhood was like and how my parents were occupied and all before they had me and all that David Copperfield kind of crap. But I don't feel like going into it if you want to know the truth. In the first place, that stuff bores me. And in the second place, my parents would have about 2 hemorrhages apiece if I told anything pretty personal about them. They're quite touchy about anything like that, especially my father. They're nice and all, I'm not saying that, but they're also touchy as hell. Besides, I'm not going to tell you my whole goddamn autobiography or anything. I'll just tell you about this madman stuff that happened to me around last Christmas, just before I got pretty run down and had to come out here and take it easy. I mean, that's all I told DB about, and he's my brother-in-law. He's in Hollywood. That isn't too far from this crummy place, and he comes over and visits me practically every weekend. He's going to drive me home when I go home next month. Maybe. He just got a Jaguar, one of those little English jobs that can do about 200 miles an hour. It cost him damn near $4,000 bucks. He's got a lot of dough now. So that kind of gives away the time period, right? There's no way you're finding a Jaguar for 4,000 bucks now. But he did, and it was a lot of money in 1950. He didn't used to have a lot of money. He used to be just a regular writer when he was home. He wrote this terrific book of short stories. The Secret Goldfish, in case you never heard of them. The best one in it was The Secret Goldfish. It was about this little kid that wouldn't let anybody look at his goldfish because he bought it with his own money. It killed me. Now he's out in Hollywood, DB, being a prostitute. There's one thing I hate, it's the movies. Don't even mention them to me. All right, just a quick pause. So here we are. Holden introduces himself. He talks a little bit about his parents, and then he tells us this. I'll just tell you about this madman stuff that happened to me around last Christmas just before I got pretty run down and had to come out here and take it easy. All right, so now we know he's going to tell us a story about something that happened in his past. That's what's going to start in the next paragraph. So we know he's telling this story from somewhere in the future. Well, this is his present time. And he's somewhere out by Hollywood. And he got really run down and he had to go out there and take it easy. So this will sort of be cleared up by the end of the book. Where is Holden? And we'll talk about it more. But something has happened to him. And he's going to tell us the story of, it's really one long weekend in his life that he's going to discuss with us that kind of made him come to this place where he was not well. And then he had to go somewhere to take it easy. His brother lives out there, DB, and he calls his brother a prostitute. I'm going to pause on that and take a sip of my tea. A prostitute is someone who sells their body for sex to profit. That's an accusation. That's a pretty strong accusation that Holden is making about his brother. So let's look at it. Do we believe his brother is a prostitute? Well, here he says he's a writer and he was writing short stories and he thought he was a good writer, but then he went out to Hollywood and I hate the movies, don't even mention them to me, and my brother is writing for them. So he's just really calling his brother a sellout here. So his brother's not a prostitute. He's a sellout. And Holden, and this is really a common perspective during that mid-20th century. A lot of people, they might have been entertained by the golden age of the movies, but people that were writers like JD Salinger, like the author, and anyone that appreciated literature, they sort of looked down on people that wrote movies. It was kind of like, yeah, you're going to entertain people, but you're not a real writer. You're just writing for the movies. So he said, his brother was actually writing good literature, good, books. And now he's, sold himself out because they pay more and he's writing film scripts. So that's really all he's suggesting there. So with that, we go to the next paragraph. And he says, where I want to start telling is the day I left Pency Prep. Pency Prep is this school in Hagerstown, Pennsylvania. So now this is a flashback, all right? We're going back to when he was at this prep school in Hagerstown, Pennsylvania, which is a fictional town. It's like Western Pennsylvania, though, because he's going to talk about going to New York City for the day. So he says, you probably heard of it. You've probably seen the ads anyway. They advertise it in about 1,000 magazines, always showing some hotshot guy on a horse jumping over a fence, like as if all you ever did at Pencey was play polo all the time. I never even once saw a horse anywhere near the place. Underneath the guy on the horse's picture, it always says, since 1888, we've been molding boys into splendid, clear-thinking young men, strictly for the birds. They don't do any damn more molding at Pencey than they do at any other school. And I didn't know anybody there that was splendid and clear thinking and all. Maybe 2 guys, if that many. And they probably came to Pencey that way. So, and I'm not going to keep pausing, but just the tone that Holden is presenting to us on this first page should be ringing to you as pretty casual, and he's very sarcastic, right? So he's got this tone that is just sarcastic, like sort of, condescending in a way tone about the way that he describes things. So just keep that in mind. Anyway, It was a Saturday of the football game with Saxon Hall. The game with Saxon Hall was supposed to be a very big deal around Pency. It was the last game of the year. You were supposed to commit suicide or something if old Pency didn't win. And these are hyperbolic. These are hyperboles, these exaggerations that he makes. I remember around 3 o'clock that afternoon, I was standing way the hell up on top of Thompson Hill, right next to this crazy cannon that was in the Revolutionary War and all. You could see the whole field from there. You could see the two teams bashing each other all over the place. You couldn't see the grandstand too hot, but you could hear them all yelling, deep and terrific on the Pency side, because practically the whole school except me was there, and scrawny and faggy on the Saxon Hall side, because the visiting team hardly ever brought many people with them. There were never many girls at the football games. Only seniors were allowed to bring girls with them. It was a terrible school, no matter how you looked at it. I like it to be somewhere at least where you could see a few girls around once in a while, even if they're only scratching their arms or blowing their noses or even just giggling or something. Old Selma Thurmer, she was the headmaster's daughter, showed up at the games quite often, but she wasn't exactly the type that drove you mad with desire. She was a pretty nice girl, though. I sat next to her once in the bus from Agerstown, and we sort of struck up a conversation. I liked her. She had a big nose, and her nails were all bitten down and bleedy looking. She had on those damn falsies that pointed all over the place, but you felt sort of sorry for her. What I liked about her, she didn't give you a lot of horse manure about what a great guy her father was. She probably knew what a phony slob he was. The reason I was standing way up on Thompson Hill instead of down at the game was because I just got back from New York with the fencing team. I was the goddamn manager of the fencing team. Very big deal. We'd gone into New York that morning for this fencing meet with McBurney School. Only we didn't have the meet. I left all the foils and equipment and stuff on the goddamn subway. It wasn't all my fault. I had to keep getting up to look at this map so we'd know where to get off. So we went back to Pency around 2:30 instead of around dinner time. The whole team ostracized me the whole way back on the train. It was pretty funny in a way. The other reason I wasn't down at the game was because I was on my way to say goodbye to old Spencer, my history teacher. He had the grip, and I figured I probably wouldn't see him again till Christmas vacation started. He wrote me this note saying he wanted to see me before I went home. He knew I wasn't coming back to Pency. I forgot to tell you about that. They kicked me out. Conflict. I think this is the conflict being introduced. All right, let's see. I wasn't supposed to come back after Christmas vacation on account of I was flunking 4 subjects and not applying myself and all. They gave me free warning to start applying myself, especially around midterms. And my parents came up for a conference with old Thermer. But I didn't do it, so I got the axe. They give guys the axe quite frequently at Pency. It has a very good academic rating. Pency, it really does. Anyway, it was December and all, and it was cold as a witch's teat, especially on top of that stupid hill. I had on my reversible and no gloves or anything. The week before that, somebody had stolen my camel's hair coat right out of my room with my fur-lined gloves right in the pocket and all. Pency was full of crooks. Quite a few guys came from these very wealthy families, but it was full of crooks anyway. The more expensive a school is, the more crooks it has. I'm not kidding. Anyway, I kept standing next to the crazy cannon, looking down at the game and freezing my ass off. Only I wasn't watching the game too much. What I was really hanging around for, I was trying to feel some kind of goodbye. I mean, I've left schools and places I didn't even know I was leaving. I hate that. I don't care if it's a sad goodbye or a bad goodbye, but when I leave a place, I like to know I'm leaving it. If you don't, you feel even worse. I was lucky. All of a sudden, I thought of something that helped make me know I was getting the hell out. I suddenly remembered this time in around October that I and Robert Teichner and Paul Campbell were chucking a football around in front of the academic building. They were nice guys, especially Teichner. It was just before dinner and it was getting pretty dark out, but we kept chucking the ball around anyway. It kept getting darker and darker. We could hardly see the ball anymore, but we didn't want to stop doing what we were doing. Finally, we had to. This teacher that taught biology, Mr. Zambesi, stuck his head out of the window in the academic building and told us to go back to the dorm and get ready for dinner. If I get a chance to remember that kind of stuff, I can get a goodbye when I need one. At least most of the time I can. As soon as I got it, I turned around and started running down the other side of the hill toward old Spencer's house. He didn't live on campus. He lived on Anthony Wayne Avenue. Sorry, I'm taking another sip of tea. I ran all the way to the main gate, and then I waited a second till I got my breath. I have no wind, if you want to know the truth. I'm quite a heavy smoker, for one thing. That is, I used to be. They made me cut it out. Another thing, I grew 6.5 inches last year. That's also how I practically got TB, that's tuberculosis, and came out here for all these goddamn checkups and stuff. I'm pretty healthy, though. Anyway, as soon as I got my breath back, I ran across Route 204. It was icy as hell, and I damn near fell down. I don't even know what I was running for. I guess I just felt like it. After I got across the road, I felt like I was sort of disappearing. It was that kind of crazy afternoon, terrifically cold and no sun out or anything, and you felt like you were disappearing every time you crossed the road. Boy, I ran that doorbell fast when I got to old Spencer's house. I was really frozen. My ears were hurting and I could hardly move my fingers at all. Come on, I said right out loud, almost. Somebody open the door. Finally, old Mrs. Spencer opened it. They didn't have a maid or anything, and they always opened the door themselves. They didn't have too much dough. Holden, Mrs. Spencer said, how lovely to see you. Come in, dear. Are you frozen to death? I think she was glad to see me. She liked me. At least, I think she did. Boy, did I get in that house fast. How are you, Mrs. Spencer? I said. How's Mr. Spencer? Let me take your coat, dear, she said. She didn't hear me ask her how Mr. Spencer was. She was sort of deaf. She hung up my coat in the hall closet, and I sort of brushed my hair back with my hand. I wear a crew cut quite frequently, and I never have to comb it much. How have you been, Mrs. Spencer? I said again, only louder, so she'd hear me. I've been just fine, Holden. She closed the closet door. How have you been? The way she asked me, I knew right away old Spencer told her I'd been kicked out. Fine, I said. How's Mr. Spencer? Over his grip yet? Over it, Holden. He's behaving like a perfect I don't know what. He's in his room, dear. Go right in. All right, so that's the end of chapter 1. You see the 2 up here. That's the start of chapter 2. So, Holden and chapter 1. So just remember, the first paragraph is his real time and place somewhere near Hollywood. He's there because he got run down and he had to take it easy. His brother DB lives nearby. Then the rest of this chapter is set at Pencey Prep, which is in this fictional town called Hagerstown, Pennsylvania. And this here is not second person narration. It's first person narration. He's Salinger, the author, is just playing with us. It's called breaking the fourth wall, right? He's talking directly to the audience. It's kind of, like an aside if this was a Shakespearean play. So he's turning to us and he's capturing our attention. And I think that was unique. This is called stream of consciousness because we're in Holden's head. It was a unique strategy that Salinger was using during that time period. Not many authors were using it, and audiences loved it. They felt like he was speaking to them, right? They felt like Holden was having a conversation with them. So that became really popular, and a lot of people ended up loving this book, I think, because of this style of writing. And it might be new to you. There's like run-on sentences. He's having a conversation with you. There's lots of sarcasm, exaggeration, figurative language, but at the same time, we're really getting to know him. We know his tone, we know his humor, we know his conflicts, we know his worries, his concerns, we know about his family, we know about his circumstances. There's so much that we find out about in this chapter because he is directly telling us this story, right? So again, we find out the major conflict is he's getting kicked out of Pencey Prep because he's failing. This is going to be the major conflict, so he'll talk more about it, but it comes out right away in this first chapter. And there was another more minor conflict, is that he, as the fencing team manager, left the equipment on the subway, so he'd kind of been isolated, and he was just by himself watching this, football game that was supposed to be important. But this theme of isolation and Holden feeling like he just doesn't belong, that's going to keep coming up. So it's right from the beginning of the book. And so we kind of we have this empathy for Holden. And I'm sure all of us have had moments where we felt like we just don't belong, sort of as though he's experiencing it. He says he sort of feels like he's disappearing. And he's just, not things aren't going well for him. So this is where he starts his story. And this is the beginning of what's going to be a long weekend where Holden is going to tell us the, 95% of this story over the course of this long weekend that starts with this, football game at Pencey Prep. So at the end of this chapter, he introduces two characters, the Spencers. He talks about a couple other characters, but he actually goes to the Spencers' house. And so the Spencers are going to be who we meet in this next chapter. So I'm going to kind of end our reading here. We've done a good job. We read a whole chapter. We talked about background. And just know that the Spencers, Mr. Spencer was his history teacher, is where we will pick up for chapter 2. So I'm going to stop my share. And I'm going to say goodbye. So reach out to me if you have questions. Make sure you've read chapter 1. Feel free to mark it up. Feel free to ask me questions. Go through that introductory PowerPoint because we'll see questions from there on our first quiz. And then also keep in mind those notes. That's how we're going to, really begin analyzing our literature, by looking at the 6 major literary elements that are always in a narrative. So with that, I hope you enjoyed chapter 1 of Catcher in the Rye, and I will see you next time for chapter 2. Okay, bye. Be well out there.